Hello, I'm Sophia, and welcome to What We Need to Know About Ukraine. Here, I learn about Ukrainian history, literature, and culture, and share my findings with you. Today's episode is about Taras Shevchenko. Taras Shevchenko was a poet, writer, artist, and a prominent public figure. His literary heritage is regarded to be the foundation of modern Ukrainian literature and, to some degree, the modern Ukrainian language. Today, he is the bard of Ukraine and sometimes is referred to as a prophet. All this, yet he was born a serf. His poetry and he himself are more than relevant, always. Taras Shevchenko was born in 1814 in Ukraine, in Cherkasy Oblast, which is just south of Kyiv Oblast. He was born to parents who were serfs in the Russian Empire, yet they are said to have Cossack roots. Shevchenko, too, then was born into serfdom. To find out more about serfdom in Ukraine, listen to my episode called Serfdom in Ukraine. But Shevchenko went from being a serf to being a desired guest in the top salons and being a political prisoner simultaneously. How could a serf become so prominent? Well, let us start from the beginning. At the age of 8, Taras Shevchenko started learning how to read and write from a precentor of a village church, who was quite harsh and could birch children, or hit them with sticks. The year after his mother died, when Taras was 11 years old, his father died too, and then he had to work for another village precentor, since this one replaced the old one. And Taras's job was to read psalms over the dead, look after water, so to carry more water if needed, and also he had to look after the fire, meaning the heating at the school. He also acted as a servant to the precentor. And all while he did this, he didn't forget to learn. He also managed to find for himself some painters that did not mind teaching him how to draw. It was when Taras was 14 that the owner of the village had died, and his son took possession of the village. Taras was then appointed as his servant and was taken with him to Vilnius. There, Taras acted as a servant as well as managed to attend drawing lectures at a university and was beaten and whipped by his master when caught drawing. A pencil drawing from 1830 shows his advanced skills at just 16 years of age. Soon, Shevchenko was taken by his master to St. Petersburg, where Shevchenko went to study art. His master wanted to potentially make an extra income by selling Shevchenko's art. While Shevchenko had lived and learned at this art school, during his free time he would venture out and practice drawing statues in the city. There he met some influential figures that would later become his friends, most of them being Ukrainians. In general, Taras Shevchenko seemed to be a very social and charismatic person, as you will see later on. He had a great many friends, and people that bought him out of slavery and jail loved him and admired him. The friends that he met while drawing out in the city were the friends, the Ukrainians and the Frenchmen, that recognized his talents and bought him out of slavery in 1838 at the age of 24. That same year, Shevchenko became a student at the Petersburg Academy of Arts. He would attend various classes and draw at a really high level, being one of the best students at the academy. During this time, he also started writing poetry that would later go into his famous collection called Kobzar. At 29, Shevchenko went to Ukraine. He visited many cities and many of his friends in those cities. He went to Kyiv and met many famous artists and poets there. Shevchenko also got to know many students at the Kyiv University, later to be named after him, and the youth warmly welcomed him as their favorite poet. Examining and admiring the historical sites and landscapes of Kyiv, Shevchenko made sketches in his album. He also traveled to the last location of the Zaporizhian siege, a Cossack settlement, and after that he returned to St. Petersburg to finish his education at the academy. During his first trip to Ukraine, Shevchenko planned to publish a series of etchings called Picturesque Ukraine, and to use the proceeds to buy his relatives out of serfdom. But despite Shevchenko's incredible promotion efforts, and with active help of some of his acquaintances and friends, the sale of the first issue was too slow, and then when Shevchenko intended to publish a second issue of the collection, due to lack of funds, it was never implemented. So his dream of buying out his brothers and sisters out of serfdom never came true. In 1844, Shevchenko wrote the historical, philosophical, and political piece called A Dream, and it was a grotesque poem that revealed to the readers the consequences of Moscow's subjugation of Ukraine, and he also published some of his work that year. A year later, Taras Shevchenko submitted an application to the Council of the Academy of Arts with a request to grant him the title of artist. The council approved and issued him, upon his application, a ticket for the rite of passage to Ukraine and back for artistic studies, as well as unhindered stay there. Shevchenko then needed permission of the government to visit his homeland, yet nonetheless, his life seemed to be getting better and better. So then he went back to Ukraine, visiting friends and going to Kyiv. He became an unofficial employee of the Kyiv Archaeological Commission. Carrying out tasks of the commission, Shevchenko traveled a lot in Ukraine, collected folklore and ethnographic materials, drew historical and architectural monuments, and kept a, quote, archaeological notes notebook. While in Kyiv, Shevchenko continued his literary activity. While traveling through his native Cherkasy region, he visited relatives. When Shevchenko got back to Kyiv, he showed the Archaeological Commission his records, drawings of historical monuments, and then was officially included as a member. In April of 1846, Shevchenko joined the Cyril and Methodius Society. It was a secret society founded on the initiative of his friend Kostomarov. With Kostomarov and other members of the society, all of them liberals, Shevchenko advocated a revolutionary way of fighting against serfdom and autocracy. Although Kostomarov was well acquainted with Ukrainian history and was acutely critical of the enslavement of Ukraine and the entire serf despotic reality of imperial Russia, Taras Shevchenko's poetry stunned him with its courage and depth and poetic power. Shevchenko's works made no less of an impression on other future Cyril Methodians. All of them were quite familiar with his unpublished poetry. Taras Shevchenko had a decisive influence on them in their revolutionary spirit. So this society was known as the Cyril and Methodius Society, or the Cyril and Methodius Brotherhood, or even the Ukrainian Slavic Society. It is the first Ukrainian secret political organization that emerged in Kyiv at the end of 1845 and was based on the traditions of the Ukrainian liberation and autonomous movement. It was created as the result of the rise of the national movement on Ukrainian lands and the activation of the all-Slavic movement under the influence of the liberation ideas of the period and the ripening of the pan-European revolutionary crisis, also known as Spring of Nations. Students and employees of Kyiv and Kharkiv universities became members of the society. During the society's existence, its ideology underwent significant changes. The task of unifying the Slavs, which became the basis for the emergence of the secret organization, was later boiled down into two specific goals: equal cooperation of the Slavic peoples and the revival of Ukraine. During all this, Shevchenko kept traveling, researching, writing, and drawing. According to many contemporaries, Shevchenko was visiting literary parties in Kyiv and read his works. The public copied and memorized Shevchenko's unprinted works. His poetry was read with great enthusiasm by students of various nationalities. Some of them specifically studied the Ukrainian language in order to understand his poems well. Many unprinted works of Shevchenko were distributed in manuscripts not only in cities but also in villages. In the summer of 1846, in a letter, Shevchenko was warned and advised to be careful. The local authorities linked the riots of the peasants in 1848, during the inventory reform, to the distribution of Shevchenko's poetry. However, Shevchenko ignored the warning and continued to spread his revolutionary works. In many memoirs of the contemporaries, episodes of Shevchenko's visual, quote-unquote, agitation among the peasants with the help of grains of wheat or rye are recorded. One grain is the Tsar. A handful of others are ministers and generals. Even more are landowners. And then he covered all of these small heaps with a handful of grain, showing the strength of the regular people. Early next year, Shevchenko received his desired position in the Kyiv University, which is now named after him, as a professor of art. But unfortunately, he didn't get to teach. The era of his arrests and captivity ensued. In March of that year, members of the Cyril and Methodius Society began to be arrested. On April 17, 1848, upon entering Kyiv to go attend a friend's wedding, Taras Shevchenko was arrested as well. During the arrest, drawings and poems were found and confiscated from Shevchenko. He was then sent under escort to Petersburg. During the interrogations, the poet did not give away any information about any of the members of the secret society. While behind bars for about 2 months, Shevchenko wrote poems. He was then accused of writing poems with which, quote, thoughts about the fictional bliss of the times of the Hetmanate, about the happiness of returning to those times, and about the possibility of Ukraine to exist as a separate state, could sow and later take root. End of quote. This investigation, however, didn't prove the poet's participation in the Cyril and Methodius Society. Shevchenko was then punished by being appointed as a soldier in Orenburg, a city far from Ukraine, for an indefinite period of time, with a ban on writing and drawing. This was a time of long and hard captivity. Shevchenko was sent to Orenburg under the supervision of a field marshal. The accompanying secret letter emphasized the need for the strictest supervision of Shevchenko. This verdict not only affected the poet, but the entire Ukrainian culture. In addition to the order to remove from the libraries and prohibit the sale of previously published works of Shevchenko, as well as his friends Kostomarov and Kulish, who were both members of the secret society, and also not to publish them in the future, but the government also demanded to strengthen the supervision, first of all of those figures who, quote, mainly deal with Ukrainian antiquities, history, and literature. It was not so much the ideas and deeds of the Cyril Methodians as the works of Shevchenko that prompted the Tsar to take such measures. In all documents, special emphasis is placed on the poem Dream, for which Nicholas I considered Shevchenko a, quote, personal enemy. In general, in his works, the poet called the emperor creator of evil, fierce Nero, godless king, the cruel persecutor of truth. In these documents, there is also an emphasis on poems in which the motives of social and national liberation struggle are seen, for which, although the poet was not recognized as involved in the Cyril and Methodius Society, he was punished most severely. The poet's speeches against the autocratic serf system were qualified as a crime committed as a result of, quote, his own corruption. So what was it then that scared the government in Taras's writings? Taras Shevchenko is a central figure of Ukrainian literary process of the 19th century. His work was of decisive importance in the formation and development of the new Ukrainian literature, and establishing universal democratic values in it. In his poetry, Shevchenko addresses topics and problems and various ideas, social, political, philosophical, historical, artistic, which before him had not yet been addressed in Ukrainian literature or were addressed too timidly and in a socially limited way. He is the founder of critical realism in Ukrainian literature. He brought a fighting spirit to Ukraine occupied by the Russian Empire with serfdom. He wrote a lot of patriotic and anti-imperialist as well as anti-serfdom poetry, which was prohibited by the imperial censorship, and therefore was both loved and hated for his work. He was the one who fought the audacious policy of national oppression. In his writings, Shevchenko acted as a formidable judge and denouncer of the entire autocratic serf system, as an implacable enemy of the landlords and Tsarism. In his works, a new positive hero is depicted, a fighter against the autocratic landlord system, a fighter for the happiness of the people. Shevchenko is the founder of the new Ukrainian literature and of its revolutionary and democratic direction. Shevchenko was the first in Ukrainian literature to act as a truly folk poet, whose works fully reflected the feelings and thoughts of the working masses and their age-old liberation aspirations. Because of this, Shevchenko was arrested, and because of this, we still admire him today. Shevchenko was then taken to Orenburg without rest at a great speed as a dangerous political criminal. The path of more than 2,500 kilometers was covered in 8.5 days. His friends asked officials for a smaller and less severe sentence, which only made confinement stricter. But he still managed to write and sketch in secret. In the fall of 1847, in the Orsk fortress, Shevchenko fell ill with rheumatism and later with severe scurvy. But just as Taras Shevchenko had enemies, he also had friends. At the beginning of 1848, a captain lieutenant, who was sympathetic to Shevchenko, included him in his Aral Sea Descriptive Expedition. And this expedition allowed Shevchenko for some time to have permission to paint, to be freed from the military and strict supervision. He drew not only what he needed to draw for the expedition to capture the surroundings, but also what he wanted to draw and write himself. During the expeditions, Shevchenko managed to create more than 200 drawings and sketches that vividly illustrated the scientific work carried out, and during the last 2 months of the trip, wrote more than 70 poems. The expedition lasted a year and a half, and they arrived back at Orenburg at the end of October 1849. Back in the city, he felt better since the expedition took a lot of his health, and in the city, he had opportunity to visit libraries, he had friends, as well as the opportunity to correspond with some acquaintances and friends who were not afraid to communicate with him, and not afraid since Shevchenko's acquaintance could compromise them in the eyes of the officials. However, Nicholas I still didn't let Shevchenko legally draw. Even under the strict supervision of the officials, Shevchenko secretly continued to paint and draw. In 4 years, he managed to create and save 4 handwritten booklets of poetry. This, however, was interrupted by the poet's second arrest. He was arrested because his drawings were discovered. He, however, was warned about this and had time to burn the most compromising ones, leaving the others to pretend as if he has not been warned. It was this time quite a serious case, since by now Taras had thousands of fans. He was once again sentenced and sent to Mangushlag Peninsula, to a fortress where he had to be jailed and serve as a soldier. He stayed there without leaving for 7 years. The conditions of the fortification were terrible. The local water was salty, the food was mostly dry and also salty, and because of this, the soldiers fell ill with scurvy, from which Shevchenko also suffered greatly. Soldiers died every year from diseases caused by the harsh living conditions, exhausting drills, fortification works, and accidents, mainly during training fires. Every day in the fortifications was awful for Shevchenko because of the senselessness, monotony, drunkenness, and immoral behavior of some of the officers. According to Shevchenko, quote, "The soldier was the poorest, most miserable man in our Christian homeland. Everything that makes life beautiful has been taken from him. Family, homeland, freedom, in a word, everything." End of quote. I think Shevchenko here summed up the things that he valued most in life: his family, his homeland Ukraine, and freedom. However, Shevchenko did not separate himself from the soldiers, and he lived simply and secretly taught some of them literacy. Shevchenko was one of the few soldiers who spent the longest time in the fortress, 7 years without a break, as I said before. His leaving the fortress, though, was never guaranteed. He was there for an indefinite amount of time, and had to ask for help of many of his friends and acquaintances. He made new contacts and worked on new relationships with the goal of eventually freeing himself from this jail. He fought for 7 years and finally succeeded. The amount of social skill that took to do this seems to be insane. In the summer of 1857, he was freed and went to some cities close to Petersburg and Moscow, since he couldn't go to either city, nor did he have permission to go to Ukraine. Finally, in February, his friends managed to get permission for him to enter Moscow and Petersburg, so he went to Moscow to visit some of his friends, the intelligentsia in Moscow, most of which were Ukrainian and Poles, and even from other countries like Finland and Lithuania. At the end of March, he went to Petersburg. Shevchenko was allowed to return to Petersburg with a certain caveat. He remained a supervised person. A number of documents emphasize that the emperor allowed his residence in Petersburg, as well as visits to the Academy of Arts, on the condition that he be properly supervised. In the first days of his stay in the city, the poet had to report to the police. In the city, he met with many people, wrote, drew, endeavored into scientific and historical research. He also tried to publish some of his works, but it was really hard and sometimes impossible because of the censorship. Even while still in exile, though, Shevchenko wanted to return to, quote, heartland Ukraine, to his native people. But at first, due to a delay with censorship regarding the publication of his poems, he did not dare to start asking for permission to go to Ukraine. And only in late spring of 1859, he submitted an application to the Academy of Arts with a request to give him a permit to go to Ukraine. Permission was granted that same month, and Shevchenko left for Ukraine the day he was notified of it. He visited many of his family and friends in Ukraine. But the poet's unrelenting dream was to create a family and to buy a small plot of land on the bank of the Dnipro, and to build a little house on the grove. And there are even Shevchenko's drawings with a plan of such a house. In an area near a city called Kaniv in Ukraine, which the poet liked very much, there was a suitable plot of land for this description. In order to purchase this plot of land, Shevchenko came to the owner of the land, and the landowner constantly hesitated about this and never sold Shevchenko this land. On July 13th, the poet was arrested for the third time. The day before, when Shevchenko was measuring a plot of land which he wanted to purchase, special attention of the gendarmes was attracted by Shevchenko's conversation with a peasant. A later report to the Kyiv governor described the poet's conversation as blasphemous. It reported that Taras Shevchenko said to everyone who was near him that there is no need for a king, lords, or priests. Shevchenko was brought to Kyiv to await his sentence. He was judged by a kind man and was allowed to live with his friends instead of a jail. In Kyiv, he met with youth, students, and teachers. Kyiv and Kharkiv students have been waiting for his arrival since 1857. Shevchenko's works in the 1850s were very popular among Kyiv students and youth and had significant impact on them. Shevchenko in Kyiv tried to rally forces for the first Ukrainian magazine. Also in his spare time, the poet worked on the poem Maria, recorded folk songs, folk tales, and in every way supported and inspired the cause of organizing Sunday schools in Ukraine. But soon his sentence was proclaimed, and he had to leave his dream of buying a house, leave Kyiv, leave Ukraine, and go back to Petersburg. Officials were completely against a revolutionary Shevchenko living in Ukraine. In St. Petersburg, Shevchenko was actively involved in the social, political, and cultural life of the city. He became a member of various societies for writers. He visited editorial offices of some magazines. Every Tuesday, the poet attended literary evenings where many cultural figures of the then Petersburg gathered and discussed topical issues of social and cultural life of the country. The circle of Shevchenko's friends continued to expand. It included writers, students, officers, journalists. Until the last days of his life, the poet was under secret police surveillance, but this did not prevent him from creating many new works. After he left Ukraine, Shevchenko with renewed vigor launched his poetic activity, which was aimed at debunking Tsarism and serfdom. Leading figures of literature, science, and art welcomed Shevchenko and considered him their equal. Shevchenko had no less authority among artists, with many of whom he was friends and collaborated with creatively. The poet's colleagues at the Academy listened carefully to his advice. In the last years of his life, Shevchenko also carried out educational work. He participated in the organization of Sunday schools for Ukraine, and being seriously ill, was engaged in the compilation and publication of the Ukrainian alphabet book. Shevchenko donated 150 copies of Kobzar to Sunday schools in Kyiv and Chernihiv, and the Ukrainian alphabet book compiled by Shevchenko ran into significant obstacles, especially from the side of censorship. Yet, with some fighting, Shevchenko began to send out the alphabet book throughout Ukraine, and he considered its release as the beginning of the great work of publishing textbooks for public schools in his homeland. When Shevchenko was already seriously ill, the first Ukrainian magazine, Osnova, began to be published, to which he submitted a number of his own works, as well as a dictionary and folklore material. Shevchenko considered the organization of Osnovy to be an extremely important matter, and he took an active part in the preparatory work for the publication of the magazine, considering it, quote, his holy work. Being in the terrible conditions of hard labor as a soldier, Shevchenko acquired an incurable disease of the heart and liver as a result of rheumatism, scurvy, and malaria. His health problems were also aggravated by sadness, deprivation, lack of family, longing for his homeland, constant nervous tension and anxiety in connection with constant persecution, and the threat of new repressions. However, the poet did not give up hope of returning to Ukraine. He urged his friends to speed up the purchase of the estate, quote, over the Dnipro. Since the fall of 1860, the poet's health began to deteriorate. In late November, Shevchenko particularly complained of chest pain. The doctor, after listening to his chest, advised Shevchenko to take care. Since then, his health deteriorated day by day. In January and February, Shevchenko sat almost endlessly in his room, only occasionally visiting some acquaintances. Shevchenko continued to work until his last days. On the night of February 24th to 25th, Shevchenko had an exceptionally severe attack of shortness of breath. He was tormented by unbearable chest pain. He could not lie down all night without finding a place for himself. On the morning of February 25th, his friend came and found him in incredible suffering. The disease was complicated by general dropsy and pulmonary edema, meaning too much fluid in the lungs. The poet died at 5 o'clock in the morning on February 26, 1861, as a result of heart paralysis. He died a day after his 47th birthday. He has written his last poem 10 days before his death, where he talked of death, a house near Dnipro, and his beloved Ukraine. He was buried in Ukraine on the hill where he for all his life wanted to buy a house. That hill is now named after him, and thousands upon thousands showed up to his funeral. Shevchenko was not just a genius. Shevchenko was also a human being. He loved borscht and salo, and his favorite drink was tea. Friends and colleagues of the poet wrote about his passion in their diaries. Mykola Kostomarov recalled about his meetings with Shevchenko in Kyiv in 1846, quote, "We spent long evenings in the summer on Kreshchatyk in the garden drinking tea. There were endless conversations and arguments between us. Shevchenko drank glass after glass, constantly asking for more tea." End of quote. Meanwhile, historian Alexander Lazarevsky, who was Shevchenko's contemporary, recalled that, quote, "Half an hour before his death, Taras Grigorovich drank his last glass of tea with cream." It is not known if Shevchenko was ever in love. Perhaps he moved around too much and was in confinement for too long, but there were definitely women who wrote about being in love with him, and he did want to buy a house near the Dnipro in Ukraine and settle there with a family. What remains from Taras Shevchenko's writings is the substantially large poetry collection called Kobzar, 9 novellas, a dramatic play, a few excerpts from his other plays, his diary, autobiography, and letters. But of course, he considered himself more of an artist. Shevchenko played an important historical role in the development of the Ukrainian literary language. First and foremost, he established its structure, which has been preserved in all essentials as the basis of the modern language. That is, he developed and improved a certain composition of the dictionary and the grammatical system of the Ukrainian language, which became the norm and model for writers, the press, the theater, etc. He seems to have selected all that was most essential and vivid in the Ukrainian language, and revealed in his work the richness, flexibility, beauty, and melodiousness of the language itself. Ukrainian author Oksana Zablushko said, quote, "What Shevchenko did in literature was half a century ahead of his time. In Europe at that time, no one wrote like that. The transition to intonation poetics to colloquial syntax and vocal polyphony within one line in most European literature was carried out by the avant-garde, not even the modernists. Therefore, even purely formally, Shevchenko is still incredibly modern. Absolutely modern poetics." This was not the way they wrote in the 19th century. End of quote. Taras Shevchenko's work brought new themes and genres to Ukrainian literature. Shevchenko's path was followed by the most outstanding leading Ukrainian writers of the following era: Marko Vovchok, Panas Myrny, Ivan Franko, Lesia Ukrainka, and others. Ivan Franko said, quote, "If I had to describe Shevchenko's poetry in one word, I would say, this is the poetry of desire for life. A free life, a comprehensive and unencumbered development of the individual and the entire society, the entire people, is Shevchenko's ideal, to which he was faithful all his life." End of quote. Taras Shevchenko's work is of world importance. Here are some statements on this matter. United States presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson both talked of Shevchenko. In the letter to Ukrainian Americans, John F. Kennedy called Shevchenko's poetry, quote, "a noble part of American historical heritage." Meanwhile, Lyndon B. Johnson said, quote, "He was more than a Ukrainian. He was a statesman and citizen of the world. He was more than a poet. He was a valiant crusader for the rights and freedom of men. He used verse to carry on a determined fight for freedom." End of quote. German writer Kurella said that, quote, "Taras Shevchenko has no equal in world literature." Meanwhile, Turkish poet Hikmet said, quote, "While people's hearts are beating, Shevchenko's voice will also be heard." And the Polish literary critic Jakubec said, quote, "He was the most popular poet of all the great poets in the world. Shevchenko's poetry was a unique phenomenon. There is no counterpart for it in the world literature." End of quote. And that is very true. Shevchenko truly was extremely popular even during his lifetime. Many upper-class citizens of the empire and even further abroad studied the Ukrainian language in order to read his poetry. Kobzar was managed to be quote-unquote cleaned by the censorship at the time, but uncensored poetry was spread around anyways. He was well-known and well-loved. Shevchenko formed and elevated his reader. His secret was, and still is, timelessness. Shevchenko's poetry is written as if it was written today. It is written in such a broad and comprehensive way that you can read it at any time and it will apply to any political situation. This constant relevance is a testament to his skill. An example is on Easter on the Straw. This is a story about how children brag about new things, and only the orphan is silent, because she has nothing to brag about. And then she says at the end, "And I had lunch at the priest's." He really pulls at your heartstrings when you know the realities of the time. Why does the orphan brag about this? Because the priest gave free lunches to the elderly and the orphans. None of the other children, except for the orphan, could eat there. This naive bragging of the orphan is even more overwhelming. We understand the terrible situation of this child. Another example would be when Ukrainian soldiers tore off the Russian propaganda poster from a billboard in one of the liberated areas in 2022. Underneath the propaganda, they revealed an excerpt of Taras Shevchenko's poem, The Caucasus. "And glory to you, dark blue mountains. Frost and snow protect you. And to you, great-hearted heroes, God does not forget you. Keep fighting, be triumphant. God himself will aid you. At your side, fight truth and glory, right and holy freedom. І вам слава, сині гори, кригою окуті, і вам, лицарі великі, Богом не забуті. Борітеся, поборете, вам Бог помагає. За вас правда, за вас слава, і воля святая." If you would like to read the whole poem, I will leave a link in the description in English. Why is Shevchenko so important for Ukrainians, now and then? Ukrainian author Oksana Zabushko said, quote, "Kobzar sews the country together." Shevchenko is about how man constructed the national cosmos in the complete absence of materials. How creative that was. End of quote. Shevchenko truly did strengthen Ukrainian national identity and brought back the will to fight. A Ukrainian book published in Lviv in 1934 called Taras Shevchenko, His Life and Art by Vasyl Simovich starts like this. 120 years have passed since God sent us a prophet to preach love and holy reason. 120 years ago, Taras Shevchenko was born. He brought good news, preached to love our native land, love its glorious past, and the sorrowful present of the time. Preached to love people. He then taught us holy reason. End of quote. Taras Shevchenko is a symbol of honesty, truth, and fearlessness, as well as great love for people. All the work of the great Kobzar is warmed by the ardent love for Ukraine, imbued with sacred hatred for the enemies and the oppressors of the people. His thoughts, his songs, his fiery anger, his struggle for the bright destiny of Ukrainians were those of millions. A famous Ukrainian poet, Maxim Rylsky, said, quote, "Shevchenko's nation does not forget and will never forget. The poet lives in the hearts of his people." End of quote. Shevchenko wrote in Ukrainian about Ukraine and drew Ukraine even when it was illegal, even when he was personally prohibited from drawing and writing by the imperial court. He fought for freedom, sovereignty, for human rights and equality. In his poetry, he appeals to moral justice and freedom of those who fight for it. Shevchenko himself is a symbol of struggle for these rights and equality, a struggle with no compromise, a struggle of suffering for what you believe in. Thank you so much for joining me today, and this was what we need to know about Ukraine this week.